hosted by the Centre for Mental Health and Community Research, which is located in the Department of Psychology, and also affiliated with University of Social Sciences Institute. My name is Sinead McGilloway, and I'm founder director of the Centre for Mental Health. And I'm also principal investigator of the SALaM Ireland study. And it's in fact the SALaM Ireland study team who is hosting this event today. It's estimated that there are, well over 100 million people worldwide who've been forcibly displaced, and a significant portion of them are refugees. In Ireland, we've welcomed, for example, almost 90,000, if not more, refugees now from Ukraine. And of course, there are many other refugees from other countries. And one of the challenges for ourselves, as in many other countries, is actually how best to promote the effective integration of refugees into society. And our focus today is really looking at integrating adolescents, young adolescent refugees, Arabic-speaking and other refugees into our societies. So our two talks are complementary in that sense. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Yvonne Leckie. Yvonne is a research fellow in the Centre for Mental Health and Community Research in the Department of Psychology, and she has research expertise in early intervention and prevention initiatives, specifically parent, child and youth health and well-being. Yvonne has a background in anthropology, psychology and community development, and she's got considerable experience in conducting community-based research with vulnerable populations as well as migrant groups. Her particular research interests include the well-being and mental health of at-risk and minority populations, such as refugees and asylum seekers, and in better understanding how services can improve and support engagement with these families. Yvonne is currently a project manager of the SALaM Ireland study. SALaM stands for Study of Adolescent Lives After Migration. And that study is exploring the psychosocial and mental health well-being of Arabic-speaking refugee adolescents, and identifying what supports are available to them in schools and the wider community. And we're also delighted to welcome Ala here, who is working with us as our cultural broker and translator on SALaM Ireland project. So, Yvonne, over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Sinead, and welcome to those online. Just to show you who the team members are there, and we also have Dr. Rita Sakir, and she's part of the English department, and Anthony Malone, and he's part of the education department. Sorry about that. So just to give some information on the study background, so Sinead said there, what our aim is, initial aim was to look at the experiences and psychosocial well-being of young Arabic-speaking students in secondary schools across Ireland. We started in 2020, and we've gathered a large amount of data since then. And so in terms of background, in 2015, as a result of the refugee crisis across Europe, the Irish Refugee Protection Programme was established. And it's a combination of the EU Relocation Programme and the UNHCR-led Refugee Resettlement Programme. Families are typically resettled from camps in Lebanon and Jordan, and also Greece. As part of the Irish Refugee Programme as well, in September 2021, as a result of the crisis in Afghanistan, there's also Afghans who were resettled. This study focuses predominantly on the IORPP, because most of the schools that we went to would have had programme refugees in them. Obviously, there are asylum seekers that come through the international protection system, the Iontas system. We had very few of them, only 2 students. So just to let you know that the data here is particularly from the perspectives of youth refugees who have come through the protection programme. So in terms of what was involved in the study, we had 2 parts to it. We had interviews with key stakeholders. These would have been teachers, language support teachers, resource teachers, as well as statutory staff, including those from TESS, TUSLA, and as well as that, a range of community voluntary organisations who would provide direct support to migrant groups, which would include Arabic-speaking groups. We also had members of resettlement program coordinators there, interpreters, as well as psychologists who worked in the 2 EROC centres in the city and across Ireland, which are the reception centres where the families arrived to initially. So we've conducted approximately 65, possibly more at this stage, interviews with key stakeholders, which also includes actually 5 parents in that as well. The second part was collecting data from the students themselves. So we had a survey which assessed their mental health well-being, so we looked at depression, anxiety, also sense of belonging in the school, peer relationships, pro-social, resilience and hope as well. So in total, we had 174, the sample size is, because we were recruiting, we got a number of Arabic-speaking students to consent to the programme. Their parents had to consent, obviously. The numbers were lower there, so we got 37 Arabic-speaking students, and then the rest of the sample was from the main population, the general population in the schools, of which there was 137. So our sample size is slightly skewed towards the general population, but we got very interesting data from those 37 students. And those 37 students also would have taken part in focus group discussions, where we kind of tease out more of that information that's contained in the survey around their sense of belonging in school, how they find their education, what challenges and barriers they have in school and the wider community. We are also ongoing with our data collection, so there's an extra 10 actually on that number. So we have actually 47 Arabic speaking students who've taken part in the study so far. Now, so what we know is that the EU aims to promote social inclusion and integration across society. And it's the same for the Irish government here as well. And what we decided to look at is Ager and Strang have indicators of integration framework that they propose, which sort of assess how well migrant groups integrate into their communities. And they look at 10 indicators here. So we thought it'd be interesting to look at that and see if we could map some of our findings onto this, to see if there's anything similar, and also to see if there was any other themes that were sort of generated from the data. So as you can see here, they have employment, housing, education and health, which would be this more structural core components, which are the main ones that are really assessed in larger surveys. And then the remaining ones underneath in terms of social connection and the other ones would be the more subjective well-being indicators that are often not measured in surveys, and certainly not in terms of an ongoing basis, but can really give a good indication of how well migrants are settling into their communities. So just briefly, social bridges here, or social bonds would be within group, so ethnic-like bonds within their own community. That supports them, so familiar patterns of relationships, and also maintaining traditions and values, which is important to them, and also helps them to integrate better. The social bridges are those between the refugee groups and the non-refugee groups, and the social links are those that would be with the wider structures of society. So, for example, government agencies. And then they looked at the facilitators' language and cultural knowledge, and also safety and stability, and also perceptions around rights and citizenship. So what we looked at here is, as we've seen, we've looked at the core domains at the top. Because we were exploring, or we were talking with the students, housing and employment aren't included in that. Housing isn't, because those families who come through the Irish refugee programme are housed approximately 6 months after arrival in the country. And employment, while the students are still in school at the time. The health is their physical and mental health, their education, obviously, but also I just touched on as well in here is the systemic issues. So the lack of homogeneity in society in general, and the lack of diversity, which I think certainly has a very strong influence on how they perceive their sense of belonging. The subjective indicators that we came across and that were very strong in the data were the language and lack of formal education, the sense of belonging and identity, psychological well-being, social isolation, discrimination and racism. And then these are what we found as the facilitators to better integration for the students. And I'm going to discuss these now in a little bit more detail. So what we have here then is a subjective indicator. So if we're looking, so language was the core theme. It was the predominant theme in our data. It sort of surpassed the psychological well-being of the students, although that is important. But everything hinged and revolved around the importance of language, which was central to belonging and central to education and so many other areas. So typically when the students arrive, they would have very poor language. They are taught the basics when they are in the reception centres, but once they start school, they're mainstreamed fairly soon after arriving in the country, and they would have just a very basic vocabulary, but they're put into classes that are age appropriate. So they're going into school and they're often unable to access the curriculum due to their lower level of language proficiency. And if you can think of for some children who might be arriving, let's say at the start of state exams, whether it be the junior cert or the leaving cert, it's a big ask for them to be able to engage with the curriculum in any kind of proper way. But also, what is another element which was very strong in the data was the lack of formal education. So they've spent time in camps, they've been displaced from their countries, they spent time in camps. Some of them have had no formal education and others would have had very limited education. So this has an impact as well on their learning. And it also as well is, it's around their ability to be able to manage that kind of structured education. Some of the teachers would have said like they wouldn't be familiar with the structured environment, being able to respond appropriately to teachers' instructions, being understanding the rules and regulations in classes, like for example, putting up your hand or not just walking out of class when you feel like it. So all of these elements also are sort of, they really compound their learning experience. And then the third element is that for a lot of them, they're not literate in Arabic. So we know that there was a study done with adult Syrian refugees back in 2022 as part of the IOM. And they found that 50% of adult Syrians had just basic literacy. So they're arriving in the classroom, they have limited English, limited formal education, and they're not literate in their own language. So all of these combined really to make it a very difficult situation for them to be able to study. So we have some quotes there, and this would have been from a key stakeholder who said exactly that: no English, no understanding of the curriculum. The second part then that we found was that sense of belonging and identity. So this would have come through on the focus groups with the students. As obviously once they arrive in the country, they don't have that extended network, or in often cases the family are broken up themselves. This affects their sense of belonging. The identity is obviously important to the students, and they're very proud to be Muslim, of course they are. So there's all of these other issues that come into play then in the classroom, as well as with their families. So we see here that we've spoken to some parents, with the stakeholders, and that there's a sort of a tension or a conflict between the traditional values of their own culture and that of the Irish host society, where the parents are very keen for them to retain those traditional aspects, and naturally the students want to fit in with their peers. So there's always that tension going on as well. And you can see this quote as well. They said it's not normal for them as a family or for their morals that they're brought up with at home. And there was another quote I remembered from a parent who said, in Syria, my burden was economic, and here my burden is moral. So it's key. He wants to make sure he keeps his children on the right path and that they adhere to their own religion and their values. And also we see here that if we'll discuss it later, is in terms of those peer relationships in the classroom. This student said, we were trying to get closer to the Irish people, have tried many times, but each time we get closer, they get further from us. The next element then is the psychological well-being and social isolation. So they've arrived over from the camps. They've spent some time in Ireland, but it can often take longer to decompress, but maybe they're not given that enough time then. They're mainstreamed into school, and students don't have the language then to be able to express themselves. They struggle then to form relationships with their peers in their classroom. They struggle to follow the curriculum, and they might start to feel isolated in the class. They often do, or they might start to feel depressed. But also there's trauma there for some of these students as well, for what they experienced either in their home country or in the camps, and that stays with them. And that can also be a block to their learning. They may have memory retention issues. And some of the students will fall into maybe two camps where you might get internalized behavior where the child is quiet, withdrawn, anxious, or they may be externalized behavior where they're more acting out, aggressive, and that would be typically the male students. So it's having an understanding of what the impact of their pre-migratory experience on their learning as well. And then we were also looking at discrimination and racism. It was interesting because when I asked some of the stakeholders about this, did they see it in their work, whether it be youth clubs or whatever, and said, oh, you don't get too much of it. But this came through very strongly, as Ala would say, in the focus groups. Really, there was discrimination and bullying in almost all. It was mentioned in, we held 6 focus groups, and I would say one of them, it wasn't as obvious, let's say, and the students found that they were fine, they didn't have that many problems. But certainly in the other schools, they said, yes, there would be. They felt that they were excluded, they felt that they were treated unfairly. In particular, I think it was the exclusion in classrooms that some of the students would have reported that. I remember there was a female student that she said, you know, I have my hand up. I always, you know, I would know the answer to the question, but the teacher would never ask me. And she said, and my friend said to me, stop putting up your hand. She's never going to ask you. And then there was also the dynamic between them and, let's say, the other student population. So I think they would have felt there was bullying there. They say it was joked. They would comment on their hijab, for example, the girls, or they would comment on where they come from. This was a sort of underlying theme and dynamic in the classroom, a kind of us and them. So this student says here, we have maths class, everyone is talking and discussing things, but she doesn't ask us anything in class, we're not included. And if we were to speak, she would snap at us. So what are the facilitators then? And what can help the students? Well, obviously they all spoke of increased EAL hours as well. This would have been coming from the stakeholders. They felt that something similar that happens on the continent, European continent, in Germany and other places where they have an intensive preschool language program to get them up to a suitable level to be able to engage with the curriculum sufficiently would help. And also they said more emphasis on conversational English. So they're learning a lot, you know, about science and maths through English. And they said, but they'd like to be able to just be able to hold a conversation so that they could make friends with their peers. And what can help them was buddy programs. I'll talk about that a little later on, but this works very well in supporting newcomer students. So the buddies are people who would obviously speak the language themselves and who would support them in those initial weeks. Translated materials as well. So a lot of schools do this anyway. So they would have the welcome sheets that are translated into the language for that student. And then what we're seeing as well is an increased access to technology in the classroom. So we know that there are schools that are allowing mobile phones into the class. Some schools were saying, well, they wouldn't do that, but there are certain schools that are allowing it, and Google Translate, so that the student can keep up with the lesson in some way, at least by having access to those, whether it be an iPad or a phone in the classroom. And I think as well, it's more support for parents learning English, because we know that, and this isn't just obviously for migrant students. I mean, some parents can't support their child around their learning. Maybe it's low educational, but I think with the Arabic speaking students, parents as well will always have much lower levels of English. They can't support their children with their homework and their learning. And that makes it much more difficult then for children to be able to move on. But also, I've just remembered, there's also the lack of digital literacy. There's an assumption that all children are going to be able to use all devices once they move here. But I know that when we started doing interviews, and it was during the COVID time, and everything was shut down, and the children were told to access technology to be able to remotely access instruction and also homework apps. But they had a huge problem with that because the students were unfamiliar with the technology and they didn't know how to start. So it's looking at those assumptions and realizing that there can be a cohort here that would be familiar with that. A strong theme in our data was community networks and collaboration. There is a huge amount of work that is happening on the ground out there. So in addition to the homeschool liaison officers who work with the families, and these will be in Dept schools, you have various organisations who are supporting migrant groups, whether it be through sporting or recreational activities in the centres, camps, running camps for the children as well, running conversational English for the parents, and women's groups and things like that. And I think the youth services has a very special role to play, and a very proactive role, that kind of detached youth work, where they can come into the schools, they can support around homework, they can support them in their communities. I know there was one school that mentioned that when the new students arrive, newcomer migrant students arrive in the school, that within the first week they're brought down to the local youth centre and they're brought to the library, so that they have that connection already with the community, and they're trying to get them to engage straight away rather than just within the school environment. The health supports, when we would have spoken to people, is culturally appropriate mental health supports. So we would have spoken to psychologists who worked in the reception centres, and certainly the adults would engage with the mental health supports. They didn't see it so much with the teenagers, but that would depend on them making that effort to approach them as well. And of course, there is that it's in Syria, the notion of mental health wouldn't be as recognised as what it is here. So it would be a reluctance, but it was mentioned several times that there's a need for Arabic speaking mental health practitioners, for example, and having an understanding of the culture that they've come from, what they've been through, the persecution and the conflict, and how that impacts on what their own health problems are, is very important. Translators, obviously, not just for health, but in terms of them accessing government services, and just having as many materials translated as possible to allow them to be able to understand the services that they're engaging with. And the social connections are very important. Naturally, all the students want to make friends, and they tend to fall within their own groups, which is not surprising. But they do want to make an effort to make friends with Irish students, other students outside of that. They did say it was a little bit more difficult. There is initiatives being run by community organisations, for example, peer-led supports mentoring that works so well. And also within the school environment, I think that could be used quite well. There are some schools that would, through a language survey, for example, identify students who speak certain languages, and when newcomers come in, then they bring them on board, not just for a buddy program, but maybe to help them around assignments or projects, and it brings up their level of English much quicker as well. In terms of community involvement, to be like minority ethnic leaders, so they act as gatekeepers in bridging that divide. So there are initiatives, for example, in Dublin City, where that seems to work quite well. And then the importance of positive teacher-pupil relationships. These are relational processes. Students would, and literature has shown that having a good relationship with the teacher helps not just with learning, but with that sense of belonging in school environment. So they feel they're being listened to, and it makes them happier to be in the school environment. If they get negative feedback from a teacher, or they're dismissed in some way, they're less likely to want to engage in the learning process. So around that kind of empathetic learning and supportive learning, and having an understanding, that cultural awareness of not just our culture, but actually the pre-migratory factors and how that's impacted on their learning and on their sense of school belonging. And then sporting and recreational activities that would fit in actually to community networks as well, that helps them get that sense of belonging. It helps them integrate a little bit quicker when you get them involved. And we know that school facilitates a sense of belonging. It's where the students are going to spend the majority of their time. All the schools adopt whole school approaches, and there are some wonderful initiatives that are being run across schools, but often it's a case of that learning isn't necessarily shared, because some teachers would say, oh, they're not really sure how to maybe manage sensitive conversations, let's say around Ramadan, or a young girl wearing a hijab. And I think there are certain schools that have adopted their own initiatives or created them, where they can manage those discussions quite effectively. But also youth services do provide those kind of facilitation workshops. The importance of expressing your own language, values and traditions. Some of the students would have mentioned that when they're together with their friends at break time and they're talking Arabic, that the teacher tries to come along and break them up and tell them to learn English. But we do know as well, the literature says, is that those social bonds that they have within their group are very important, and it doesn't detract from making friends outside it. They get a sense of comfort and a sense of belonging from that, and from that point on they can then reach out into the community and try and make friends. So the survey of languages in school, I've spoken about that before. There's also the greater use of technology, translation apps in the classroom. They're being used far more, and then a range of activities, the amber yellow flag, the buddy programs, peer mentoring, PPLIs, heritage language programs. Now, they're not offering Arabic at the moment, they might do in the future, but they offer Chinese and Ukraine, and so students can get to learn their own language. And it's something QFI, Qatar Foundation International, who fund us, are looking at as well, is these programs to be able to, for students who will be able to want to bring up their own Arabic literacy. And there was a summer program that was run recently up in Drogheda that was very successful. So in the morning, it was a 2-week program. In the morning, they learned English, and in the afternoon, they learned Arabic. And they got to boost their own language, English language proficiency, and at the same time, they were able to learn their Arabic. So that's those kind of initiatives really work well. Restorative practice and trauma-informed approaches are very good for conflict resolution. It's not just between migrant groups and the rest of the population, but also just in general for students. And parental support. Now, this would have come through on the focus groups. So all the parents are very supportive of their children. They want them to do well. There is probably that notion of managing parental expectations, as some of the stakeholders would have said, is that if their child, let's say, does speak fluent English and they want them to be doctors and engineers and lawyers, and like, yeah, you know, they're not at that point that they will be able to do that. But it's also supporting the parents to be able to improve their own language so that they can help to integrate better into the community, which helps the children as well. We know some schools are looking at offering English courses on site, and there are schools, that offer parenting programs on site. Materials translated, I mentioned that before. And for parents who are not literate in Arabic, one teacher mentioned to me that she sends audio files to the parent on the mobile. So there's always ways around how you can engage the parents as well in that. And just something I wanted to mention was around, I think it's the expectations. It's managing expectations, parental expectations, but also teacher expectations. As some teachers said, some of these students are not going to be able to sit a state exam. So what can we do for them before they leave school? So maybe if they don't start school till 15 or 16, realistically, they may not be able to sit the leaving cert. So it's getting them into the school, it's getting them to learn whatever language you can, or as much as you can, and learning as much of the curriculum as they possibly can to be able to help them, at least when they leave school, to be able to maybe engage in further education or to get some kind of job. And then the systemic issues, this would have come through, and Alec would be able to speak about this, was that some of the students said, but we don't see ourselves reflected in society. We don't see role models. We don't see teachers who wear hijabs, or we don't see migrant teachers in the classroom, which is an important point. And I think in Irish society, there's probably, it's less diverse as what it should be. I think it will be a process which will be quite slow to change. We know that the last census, that 12% of the population identify as non-Irish. So that will eventually filter down. We know that there's a migrant strategy that concluded in 2021, I think. And that will be useful in sort of informing policy and in progressing that, I think, around more representation across society. So I think what we find this a very useful framework for assessing the integration, or really what we want is the inclusion of migrant groups, whether they be Arabic speaking, whether they be Ukrainian or whatever country that they're from. And it's understanding the impact of their own culture and also on their pre-migratory experiences, on their educational well-being and on their integration into the classroom and wider society. There is an interdependency between these. So, for example, housing would be very important for psychological well-being, of a sense of belonging. Language is very important for education. So they're not discrete, but they all link into and they all feed into each other. They're not mutually exclusive. And we know that integration is a two-way process. As we say, for refugees or migrants, learning a new culture, engaging in employment, making those social connections and gaining that feeling of belonging, that is their role to an extent. But for the host society, it also has a responsibility of opening up the institutions more widely and granting equal opportunities to all. And I suppose what we would have learned as well from the study was that I think the Arabic-speaking students represent quite a unique group of learners, because the time that they would have spent in camps, the experiences that they had from being displaced from their country, the lack of English, lack of formal education, all has a huge impact on their learning ability, possibly compared to other groups, not all of them obviously, because the Ukrainians have something similar. But I think with the Arabic speaking group, they have been out of schooling for a very long time, and they've been held in camps, in some cases up to years. And having an awareness of that and how that influences the children in the classroom is very important. So I think that's it for the moment. It's just like a very quick tour, because some of those points there would actually probably warrant a good bit more attention, but that's the best that we can do. If there's any questions at all, that's our website and my email address. And just to a shout out to any schools who may have Arabic speaking students and would like to be involved in our study, we would love that, because we will be wrapping on summer, but we would love to be able to get a few more, increase our sample size of Arabic speaking students. So please do feel free to get in contact with me. And thank you for your time.
Great, thank you so much, Yvonne, for that very stimulating overview of our research and some of the many challenges as well that we've had in terms of recruitment and COVID and et cetera, et cetera. There may be some questions from the audience, either online or in person, but maybe we'll hold off on those until Daniel maybe has spoken. So allow me to introduce to you Dr. Daniel Shephard. He's a postdoctoral fellow in international sustainable development at Indiana University in Bloomington. His current research focuses on the inclusion of displaced learners in public school systems and makes contributions to comparative and international education, forced migration, analytical sociology, and development studies. His PhD is in comparative and international education from Columbia University, and he's going to talk to us today about a transnational community of practice that he's establishing to explore teaching in the context of forced displacement. So Daniel, I'm very happy to hand over to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it was really interesting to hear more about Yvonne's work and the team at SALaM. It's really interesting, and I think some of the things that were said connect also with some of the things we're doing with this transnational community practice. So before I go too far, can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So today I'll talk a little bit, much has been said already, but just from my perspective, I'll share a few other key kind of facts and figures about displacement, forced displacement, and education. Then I'll talk about this particular transnational community of practice, which we're calling Teachers Supporting Teachers, and some of the challenges and tools we've used, and I would like to solicit people online and in the room any sort of feedback and questions, depending on how much time we have at the end. So this will be more of a practice-oriented presentation, because this is an effort that we've been spending a lot of time designing, but it's just started. So we don't necessarily have lots of results, but we can share kind of the process and the challenges and the way we've started to address some of those challenges. So just a little bit of background adding to what's already been said. is given that a lot of my work has been in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, I always think it's interesting to note for people that actually one of the oldest Western laws around resettling refugees and providing support for them dates back to the 1800s and the Ottoman Empire. So very much before the current refugee conventions from the UN system. And then of course you had the League of Nations and the UNHCR. And in 2012, and this is a key point for some of the work that I'm doing, you had this shift in countries of first asylum. We know that while some refugees are resettled in Ireland, the US, and other places, the vast majority, about 80%, remain in low and middle income countries, usually neighboring the country from which they're displaced. And prior to 2012, the policy was largely to provide non-formal education or education using the curriculum of their country of origin or something similar to it, with the idea that we would prepare them to go back to their country once things stabilized. In 2012, due to various factors, there was a shift in this global policy towards including refugees and promoting the inclusion of refugee students in the national public school systems of those countries of first asylum. Now, again, countries of resettlement, such as Ireland, the US, are different, where this has been traditionally the case that, of course, refugees, once their claims are accepted, are given access to social services. But where the majority of refugees spend a lot of their time, as Yvonne was sharing, they don't have necessarily always the same degrees of access to schooling. But this is something that's been shifting. So this is the context in which this work is being carried out. As already has been mentioned, there are over 36 million refugees globally. And these are kind of the official refugees from the UNHCR in Ireland, about 100,000, but this doesn't necessarily capture those that are moving within the European Union, and such as those coming from some other countries where maybe, for example, Ukrainians were displaced nearby countries and then they moved onward to Ireland, for example. But the official numbers for Ireland are about 100,000, and the official numbers for internal displacement is about 70 million. All of these numbers are very much estimates, as it's very difficult to always track the clear picture. But one thing we're saying, which I think is important, which harkens to the work of Fitzgerald and Arar and others, is while these numbers are daunting, it's worth reminding ourselves that they're actually lower than they were, for example, during World War II, when we had much less resources available and much less experiences and research available to support the way in which we help refugees achieve inclusion. So while the numbers are daunting, they're not the highest they've been in history, but they are unfortunately increasing in recent decades. So you see this increase both in terms of the global numbers, but also in terms of the numbers of refugees in Ireland over the past 5 years. And if we go back to around 2012, you'll see also these large increases globally, with the crisis in Syria as one example that triggered a large displacement. The challenges facing refugees and non-native English speakers in countries like the US and Ireland have already been articulated by Yvonne, but I wanted to show kind of what the global picture looks like in terms of at least access. So the estimates are that in primary school enrollment, so access to primary schooling across the globe, refugees access primary schooling at about a rate of 68%. So this leads to some of those gaps in schooling, which were mentioned earlier. And if you compare this to low-income countries, the low-income country rate of primary enrollment is actually over 100%. That's above 100 because some older learners who missed out are now attending primary school. So this is just to show it's not just a question of resources, although resources do come into play. There are other factors at play. At secondary school enrollment, there's a drop in access to secondary schooling, but that drop is probably driven primarily due to resources and availability of secondary schooling broadly in low and middle income countries where about 80% of refugees are located. If you look at the US data where I'm currently located, and we don't have a clear indicator in the national data for refugees, but the closest approximator would be English language learners. And we know that they complete secondary schooling at a lower rate than the average across the country. So this is just to articulate that displaced learners face educational challenges despite the 2012 shift in policies globally to include refugees in education systems. So it's within this context that we wanted to design a different sort of community of practice and learning and professional development opportunity for teachers. And so traditionally, especially in those countries of first asylum, but also often in countries like the US and Ireland, you'll have professional development for teachers that's design in which the experts, who may be people who are at the university or have PhD, provide some sort of presentation or some sort of activity from which the teachers learn. And in international development contexts and countries of first asylum, you'll often have international organizations or people coming from a capital to come and conduct these trainings. But as was mentioned earlier, the majority of displaced populations are displaced for many years, right? The median number of years of displacement is around 5, although it's difficult to exactly estimate. And the mean of displacement is around maybe 10 or more years. And then you have people displaced for 20 plus years in some contexts. So some of my work in Jordan, you have students who have been there for about 11 years and they're 12 years old, and therefore they have no memory of their country of origin. So within that context, what we wanted to do is change the way that this sort of professional development and co-learning happens so that teachers from different countries that have experienced different types of displacement, both refugees and internal displaced learners, could learn more from each other, especially teachers in the United States learning from teachers in other countries that have been dealing with this for many more years, perhaps at a larger scale. So the idea of this is to have each month, and I'll talk more about the structure, you'll have teachers from different countries around the world, all of which are continuously in the community of practice, giving presentations on practices that they found useful in the classroom to support displaced learners. And so the idea is that the teachers are learning from each other, but also learning from country to country and learning from the global south flowing to the global north. So the idea is to have a global community, to have global learning, to strengthen capacity, and to have idea of knowledge equity where all teachers have something to share. And then the hope is at the end of this, and again, as I said, we're in the middle of it, or kind of on the front end, to share those learnings out from the teachers rather than kind of best practices flowing from policymakers to teachers, but also from teachers out to policymakers and researchers. So just to give you an idea of the profile of the teachers, they're teaching grades 4 to 10. This was a decision to exclude those that might be working more at preparation for tertiary school at the later grades, or those at the very early grades, which might have different sorts of challenges. These are classroom teachers that work with displaced students. So these might be formally classified as refugees. They might be internally displaced. We have teachers in Afghanistan, for example. And they might be those who are in displacement-like situations, but maybe classified as migrants, such as some of those that come into the United States from certain countries in the Northern Triangle, where they might not be officially classified as refugees. These are public, charter, and private school teachers, so we're not excluding any particular school system. And the commitment from these teachers is not a huge one, but one that spans a long period of time. So we meet once a month, so it's about 10 plus hours between February and August of this year. And we have monthly meetings online, and I'll talk about some of the challenges of finding a time that works across countries in a moment. And the idea is to have a 30-minute presentation from a group of teachers about their expertise as teachers, followed by discussion and sharing across countries and communities. The benefits, of course, are the professional development and strengthening of capacities, but also building community, and teachers are offered a certificate and to interact with 9 different countries. So here are the countries from which the teachers are joining. So this is where the teachers are located. It's not necessarily where the populations of students are coming from, those who are displaced, but we have teachers joining from Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, Colombia, Ireland, and many thanks to SALaM for helping connect us with a teacher there, Jordan, Lebanon, Uganda, and Ukraine. So as you can see, we had hoped to have some folks from East Asia, Burma, and, Myanmar, and so forth, but that's quite difficult for policy reasons. The teachers, for example, in Bangladesh are not allowed to access the internet because they're not supposed to be participating in professional development because there's restrictions placed on teachers there from the government. But also time zones become a challenge once you get further and further away, which I'll talk a bit about more, as I mentioned. The languages in the community of practice that are covered are Arabic, Azerbaijani, Dari or Persian, English, Spanish, and Ukrainian. And this touches nicely on some of the things that were shared in the previous presentation, in terms of the topics that are emerging from the teachers as things that they wanted to cover. So we had some preparatory calls with different teachers to ask them, what do you think is important in this community of practice that we cover? Obviously, you know, I have some ideas and some others have some ideas, but these really are supposed to be collectively decided by the teachers. And so our first session, which was just completed in February, was on multilingual classrooms, how to manage that when you don't speak all the languages, how to use translanguaging using different strategies. And how to manage different kind of language communities, even within one sort of mother tongue, if you will. So that was the first session. The second session, we're going to have teachers from Colombia who are on the border with Venezuela sharing about their experiences to support social cohesion among their learners. And then the subsequent month we'll have, in April, we'll have a session on providing psychosocial support for learners. It's interesting that some of these map a little bit onto those factors that Yvonne shared. And then the next month, which has been decided, is on learning gaps. So those learners who maybe missed some years of schooling or switched between country contexts and therefore had to deal with switching between different systems and falling behind. The other sessions are to be determined and based on the interests of the teachers. So to share a few challenges that we're facing. So one is facilitation online. That's in terms of also facilitation across languages. So for example, if people are asking a question in a language and the interpreters are busy interpreting, then putting that into Google Translate and trying to respond back in good time, realizing we need multiple people online to help support the facilitation. Another challenge is around time zones. So essentially we had to pick a time that was a struggle for some context. To give a concrete example, it's difficult for the Ugandan teachers to join because they're in a camp-based setting and there are security concerns and transportation challenges in the evening, and this is ending up in their evening. And so there needs to be support from an NGO to get them to a space where they can join and get them back home safely. But that was the only time that worked for another country in terms of that group of teachers. And so we were trying to balance what could we do to make sure that everyone can join effectively. We had tried to do something during teachers' normal work week and get permission from their schools to take time off because we know teachers are overburdened, but it's essentially impossible. And we talked to other people who have done this, and Saturdays or weekends are kind of the only option. Of course, Saturdays are the best because then in countries that have their work week from Sunday to Thursday, such as Jordan, it also works for them. So another challenge is around managing the languages, and I'll talk more about kind of how we're doing that, and technical challenges with doing so. And then also leadership in the sense of really making sure that the teachers feel that they own the sessions and can present as being experts and not presenting themselves as those who are learning from those of us that might be in a university setting, because that's very much the norm. So the tools that are kind of helping support these challenges, I already mentioned having multiple facilitators. but also using simultaneous translation. So although the kind of automatic translation in Zoom is good for some languages, it's not so good for other languages. So it doesn't necessarily work so well for Azerbaijani and Dari and things like that. And so we have simultaneous translation, which has cost implications. And it's not always working easily with the translators. So we had some hiccups where some of it had to be consecutive instead of simultaneous. And with multiple languages, that can take a very long time. And then to use Google Translate sheets to automatically translate. So if teachers want to say something, they can type it there, and then we set up columns that'll auto-translate it into all the other languages as best it can, given the errors that do arise with some of those languages, to enable teachers to better talk across language groups. It's still a work in progress because some teachers are more or less comfortable with using those sorts of tools. And then for getting kind of feedback and activities pre and post sessions, Qualtrics has nice features now with integrating Google Translate to translate all the sort of questions that might arise so that things can be done a little bit more quickly. So just to wrap up, I want to talk about some of my broader work because it might touch on some of the comments that were made in the previous presentation and also the motivation for this community of practice. Some of my other work is looking at models of school inclusion that are occurring around the world. So Sarah Dryden-Peterson and others have mapped out how since 2012, the way in which learners are being included in those countries of first asylum, which then constitute kind of the previous learning experience of learners coming to Ireland and other locales for settlement. There's essentially three models. So one is a system inclusion where it's the curriculum and the certification and perhaps the same teachers, but that the students are still in a different space and still in a different physical location. And some of my research on this in Jordan is showing that it's actually these schools that have stronger sense of school belonging. And probably it's due to the fact that students can be around those that they feel comfortable with to some degree, but it's also because these are the schools that have more surveillance. And in some of the other schools, there's much more corporal punishment and abuse of especially male learners, which might also be part of the story with some of the behavioral challenges that arise with male learners, as that's happening, at least in Jordan, very exclusively in a gendered manner. The second model is these system inclusion, but with also school inclusion. So the same physical space, the same compound, but often with temporal separation where you have a morning shift that's primarily the local population, in Jordan's case, Jordanian students, and the afternoon primarily non-local or refugee populations, but not 100%. So there is some mix. So what I've been seeing in some of my work is actually these shifted systems, which people worried were creating segregation, actually are facilitating more integrated social networks in some cases. And this might also help us think about these projects like were mentioned earlier, where you have maybe an afternoon session in Arabic and the regular school in English, and having some overlap between the populations in both those so that students can have different spaces in which they're kind of more the majority or more the minority, where they can kind of explore different ways of making social connections across groups. And then you have the full inclusion model we all imagine in the same school and class. And this is important for structural senses of inclusion and probably long-term inclusion, but it doesn't always facilitate the best integration and the best sense of belonging. So I know we're basically at time. So I do have these kind of questions. Oops, sorry, if I can get. So if anyone does want to post questions that we don't get to that I can perhaps respond to, or ideas, I have this little Jamboard here. For those of you who are familiar with that, you can basically put Post-its on there. But with that, I'll say a quick thank you, and then I'll go back to the Jamboard link. This is the center I'm with, the Center for the Study of Global Change. Those of you that know it know that they have a lot of other activities around refugees, but also sustainable development and internationalizing curriculum. So that's a link to the listserv. Some of those activities are online. Obviously, many of them are in Bloomington, Indiana, so they're too far away for many of you, but hopefully that's useful, and feel free to email me anything you have. So with that, I'll close and say thank you, and I'll just leave that up in case anyone wants to post questions, because I know we're close to time. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Daniel, for that. Another excellent talk today. You've got a job of work there, haven't you, in terms of all those challenges that you're dealing with across different languages and cultures and so on. But it's hugely interesting. Do we have any questions I can't actually see the chat there on Teams. I'm not sure if we have any questions. Do we have any questions from the floor at all for either Yvonne or Daniel? Maybe I could start actually. Daniel, just wondering about your own work. You mentioned knowledge mobilization. Yeah. So how do you plan to use the results of your study? How's that going to work? Or how are you going to mobilize that knowledge to maximize its impact?
It's a great question. So one of the things we're working on doing is working with the teachers to identify key points of contact for them that could be helpful, whether that's a principal or an NGO they work with, or school system or district, so that we can pre-identify who those people are so we can share that later. That's still a work in progress. And the other is sharing through some of the kind of classic channels that are more practitioner focused with the international or the interagency network for education in emergencies, which shares a lot of kind of open source resources for people working with these populations. But also with the, in Indiana, there's different mechanisms for sharing out content with the Department of Education here. So we'll share through that avenue as well. So those are some of the key venues that we're thinking of sharing, but trying to do it at the front end rather than just at the back end, so that we can build some of the relationships and contact some of the people and ask them how they would like the knowledge to be received so that they can most make use of it.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. That sounds great, Daniel. And in terms of the teachers as well, it's a quite significant commitment for them, isn't it? In terms of time and so on. Have you had many difficulties in that sense of getting teachers to actually join the community of practice?
It's interesting. It's been much easier to get teachers from other countries than from the United States. I don't know if that's a reflection of this country. But we do offer an honorarium, both to compensate them for their time. So it's basically a small amount of money. It differs a little bit by country and by kind of cost of living. So at least that covers some of the costs. For example, in Afghanistan, they have to pay for high-speed internet, which is extremely expensive right now. So it is a challenge to recruit, but it's been interesting that it's been easier to recruit teachers in some of the most difficult situations and harder in some of the more affluent situations.
Yeah, gosh, that's really interesting. Yeah, no, thanks for that, Daniel. It sounds super interesting. Do we have any more questions at all online at all from anyone, or shall we? If not, then maybe we can wrap it up for today. Anyone else from the audience? We're happy to close it out there. Okay, listen, thank you so much again to our speakers today, Yvonne Leckie and Dr. Daniel Shephard. And we're particularly delighted, Daniel, that you could join us today to talk to us about your own research. So many thanks to those of you who have come along today to attend in person, and also those of you who joined us online. And we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much.